The air in the diner always smelled the same, a greasy, comforting mix of fried potatoes, burnt coffee, and the sweet, cheap syrup they used for the pancakes. It was a smell that clung to your clothes and hair, a constant reminder of the hours spent within these faded, chipped walls. For the young woman wiping down a table with a damp, gray cloth, it was the scent of her life. Her feet ached in a way that felt permanent, a dull throb that started in her heels and traveled all the way up her spine. She had been on her feet for 10 hours already, with another 4 to go on her double shift. Every movement was an effort, but she kept a small, tired smile on her face for the customers who still trickled in. It was a mask she had perfected, one that said, "I'm happy to serve you." Even when her soul felt heavy with exhaustion, her name wasn't important here. She was just the waitress or hun or miss. But in the quiet moments, the stolen seconds between taking an order and delivering a plate of food, she was someone else. Tucked into the pocket of her apron, nestled next to a stray pen and her order pad, was a small, folded napkin. It was soft from being handled so much, the ink on it slightly smudged. On it she had written a few lines, words that had come to her in the middle of the night when she couldn't sleep, worrying about bills. Asterisk, concrete cracks, and the city sighs, a little light in a million eyes. It wasn't a poem, not really. It was a song, or at least she hoped it could be one day. It was a secret dream, a fragile little bird she kept hidden in the harsh, noisy world of the diner. This dream was the only thing that made the endless cycle of work bearable. Every tip she earned, every dollar she carefully tucked away, was for more than just rent and groceries. It was for her mother's medicine, for the specialist appointments that cost a fortune. Her mother, once a vibrant woman who filled their small apartment with laughter, was now tired and frail, her body fighting a long, slow battle. The weight of it all sat on the young woman's shoulders, a heavy cloak she wore every single day. But when she thought about the lyrics, about the melodies she could almost hear in her head, the cloak felt a little lighter. It was a promise to herself that this life, this grind, was not all there would be. The bell above the diner door jingled, a sound so familiar she barely noticed it. But this time something was different. The usual chatter of the late-night crowd seemed to dip, a hush falling over the room like a sudden fog. She looked up from the table she was cleaning and saw him. He was a man who didn't belong in a world of cracked vinyl booths and ketchup bottles. He stood in the doorway, framed by the neon glow of the "open" sign, and he seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He was dressed in a suit that looked like it cost more than the diner made in a month, dark and perfectly tailored. His hair was cut sharp, and his face was a mask of cold indifference. Behind him, 2 younger people followed, dressed in equally expensive clothes, their eyes glued to their phones, laughing at something that wasn't funny. They were an entourage, a human shield of wealth and importance. The man's eyes scanned the diner, not as if he were looking for a place to sit, but as if he were inspecting a piece of property he was considering buying. His gaze was dismissive, sliding over the tired faces of the regulars, over the cook who was staring back from the kitchen pass-through, and finally landing on her. He didn't see a person. He saw an employee, a function. He gestured with a sharp flick of his wrist towards a large booth in the corner, the one she had just finished cleaning. She gave a small nod and grabbed a set of menus, her heart beating a little faster. This was not going to be an easy table. As she walked over, she could feel the tension in the room. The other customers were pretending not to stare, but their movements were slower, their voices quieter. The man and his group slid into the booth, moving with an easy confidence that came from never having to question their place in the world. They immediately started talking about things she couldn't understand: stock options, mergers, a hostile takeover. The words were sharp and aggressive, just like the man who seemed to be their leader. She placed the menus on the table with a steady hand, her practiced smile firmly in place. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" The man didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on his phone, his thumb scrolling rapidly. "Water," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "Sparkling. Not tap. And make sure the bottle is cold. I don't want it sitting out." One of his companions, a young man with a slick smile, ordered a complex coffee drink while the other just waved a dismissive hand. She nodded again, her smile never faltering, even though a small knot of anger was tightening in her stomach. She had dealt with rude customers before, but this was different. This wasn't just rudeness. It was a complete and utter lack of respect. A belief that she was so far beneath them that she was barely worthy of their attention. She turned and walked back towards the kitchen, the feel of their collective stare on her back. She could hear them resume their conversation, their laughter echoing in the now quiet diner. She took a deep breath, pushing the anger down. She couldn't afford to lose her temper. She needed this job. She needed the tips. But as she reached for a clean glass, her fingers brushed against the napkin in her apron pocket. The words she had written came back to her, asterisk, a little light in a million eyes. She looked around at the familiar, grimy walls of the diner, at the tired but kind face of the cook, at the old man sitting alone at the counter. This was her world. It was hard and it was tiring, but it was real. It had heart. And that was more, she suddenly realized, than the man in the expensive suit would probably ever have. She grabbed the sparkling water from the cooler, the cold bottle a small comfort in her hand, and prepared to go back out there. She didn't know it yet, but this night was going to change everything. She walked back to the table, the cold bottle of sparkling water feeling like a shield in her hand. She placed it on the table with a quiet thud, the sound swallowed by the loud, confident conversation of the group. The older man finally looked up from his phone, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the bottle. He touched it with his fingertips, a look of deep suspicion on his face. "Is this cold enough?" he asked, his voice sharp and cutting. "It's sweating, which generally means it's sufficiently chilled," she replied, keeping her tone neutral, professional. She had practiced this tone for years, a voice that could deflect insults without breaking. The younger man with the slick smile laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "She's got a bit of a spark, boss," he said, nudging the woman next to him. "You can't get good help anywhere these days. They all think they're entitled to something." The woman didn't say anything, just sipped her coffee and looked around the diner with a bored expression, as if she were cataloging everything that was wrong with it. The young woman felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She clenched her jaw, biting back the words that wanted to escape. She thought of her mother sleeping in the next room, the soft sound of her breathing the only music that mattered. She thought of the pile of bills on the kitchen counter. She took a silent breath and let the anger go, watching it dissolve into the tired air of the diner. "Can I take your order now?" she asked, her voice a little softer this time. The man in the suit ignored her question. He gestured towards the empty plates on the table. "Clear these," he commanded, not as a request, but as an order. She nodded and began to carefully stack the heavy ceramic plates. As she reached for the last one, the younger man suddenly leaned back, stretching his arms and bumping her elbow. The stack wobbled, and she stumbled, trying to save it from crashing to the floor. In that moment of clumsy desperation, her small, worn notebook slipped from the pocket of her apron. It fell to the floor with a soft flutter, landing open on the grimy linoleum tiles. Her heart stopped. It was her private world, her sanctuary, lying exposed for everyone to see. Before she could react, the younger man had bent down and picked it up. "Ooh, what's this?" he said, a wicked gleam in his eyes. He held it up as if it were a strange insect he had just discovered. "Looks like our little waitress has a secret." He flipped through the pages, his smirk growing wider with each turn. He cleared his throat and began to read in a mocking, sing-song voice. "Scraping by on borrowed time, hoping for a nickel's chime. City lights are cold and gray, wash the tiredness away." The words, so personal and so true to her, sounded cheap and ridiculous coming from his lips. A wave of shame washed over her, so intense it made her feel dizzy. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. He tossed the notebook onto the table in front of the older man. "Here, boss, have a look. She's a poet." The man in the suit picked it up, his expression unreadable. He didn't mock it like his friend. Instead, he studied it with a cold, analytical curiosity, like a scientist examining a specimen. He slowly read the pages, his eyes moving back and forth. The diner had fallen completely silent now. Everyone was watching the scene unfold, a theater of cruelty playing out in the corner booth. The young woman stood frozen, her hands empty, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt completely exposed, stripped of her uniform and her professional mask. Leaving only the vulnerable girl with dreams she was too afraid to say out loud. The older man finally looked up from the notebook, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only a strange, calculating light. He had found something he could use. He saw the shame in her face, the way her shoulders slumped in defeat, and it seemed to give him an idea. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He leaned back in the booth, holding the notebook in one hand like a trophy. "You know," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear, "I'm a charitable man. I believe in giving people opportunities." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick wallet. He casually counted out 10 $100 bills, placing them on the table in a neat, tidy stack. The sight of so much money was breathtaking. It was more than she made in 2 months, enough to pay off her mother's most recent medical bill and still have money left over. It was a lifeline, a solution to all her problems, and it was sitting right there in front of her. "I will give you this $10,000, he continued, his voice dripping with false generosity. "Right here, right now. All you have to do is get up on this table," he said, patting the formica surface, "and sing a little song for us." The room was so quiet she could hear the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He paused, letting his words sink in, enjoying the power he held. "It won't be one of your sad little poems," he said with a dismissive wave of the notebook. "No, I'll give you the words. It's a simple song, really. It's about being a good little waitress and how lucky you are to serve me. Something like, 'Oh, thank you, sir, for gracing my table. Your money is great, and you're so much more able.'" His friends snickered, their laughter like tiny needles in the thick silence. He framed it as a game, a fun little challenge, but everyone in the room knew what it really was. It was a public execution of her spirit. He was buying her dignity for a price, and he was making her choose in front of an audience of strangers. Her eyes moved from the stack of money on the table to the smug, triumphant look on his face. The air felt thick and heavy, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The silence in the diner was a heavy, living thing. It pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Her eyes were locked on the stack of money on the table. $10,000. It was a magical number, a sum that existed only in daydreams. In her mind, she could see it transforming into a clear, plastic medical bag, the liquid inside slowly dripping into her mother's arm, bringing color back to her pale cheeks. She could see it as a month's rent, paid on time, with no worry. She could see it as a warm coat for the winter, a proper meal instead of leftovers. The temptation was a physical force pulling at her, whispering that it was just a silly song, a small price to pay for such a huge reward. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, trapped between the desperate need for that money and the crushing weight of the humiliation it would cost. The man in the suit watched her, a predator enjoying the moment before the kill. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the way her gaze flickered between his face and the cash. He leaned forward, his voice a low, persuasive hiss. "Think about it. 1 minute of your time, one silly little song, and your problems are over. Isn't that what you want? To stop scraping by? To stop worrying?" His words were poison, coated in the sweet promise of an easy way out. He was not just offering her money. He was offering her an escape from the life she hated. And in that moment, she hated it more than anything. She hated the tiredness, the constant worry, the feeling of being invisible. But looking at his smug, confident face, she realized she would hate herself more if she gave in. Something inside her shifted. It was a small, hard knot of anger that had been tightening in her stomach for years. The anger at the unfairness of it all, at the people who had so much and cared so little. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, steady resolve. She thought of the words in her notebook, not the ones he had mocked, but the ones about finding light in the darkness. This was her darkness. This was her moment to find a light, however small. She took a slow, deep breath, and when she looked at the man again, her eyes were clear. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "I'm not going to sing your song." A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the diner. The man's smile faltered just for a second, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He had not expected this. He had expected her to crumble, to take the money, to perform like a trained monkey. "And I don't want your money," she continued, her voice growing a little stronger. "It's dirty. It feels dirty." The younger man started to say something, a sneer forming on his lips, but she held up a hand, not to him but to the whole room. "But," she said, and her voice was steady now, "you wanted to hear a song. So I'll sing you one." She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on the table, on the money, on the man who thought he could buy her soul. She walked away from them, towards a small, empty space near the counter, away from the tables. She didn't climb on anything. She didn't need to. The stage was the worn linoleum floor, and the spotlight was the collective gaze of every person in the room. She stood there for a moment, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She closed her eyes, shutting out the diner, the man, the money. She thought of her mother, sleeping peacefully. She thought of the city outside with its millions of stories, its struggles, and its small, quiet joys. And then she began to sing. She had no microphone, no music. The sound that came out of her was not perfect or polished. It was a little rough around the edges, but it was filled with a raw, powerful honesty that silenced the room completely. It was the song from her notebook, the one he had mocked. But now, in her voice, the words were transformed. Asterisk, concrete cracks, and the city sighs, a little light in a million eyes. Her voice rose and fell with a natural, untrained grace, carrying the melody on a wave of pure emotion. It was a song about being tired, but not giving up. It was about finding beauty in broken things and strength in the struggle. It was about the quiet dignity of a life lived with love, even when you have nothing else. As she sang, the atmosphere in the diner began to change. The tension drained away, replaced by a sense of shared humanity. The old man at the counter, who had heard her hum snippets of the song before, had tears in his eyes. The cook, leaning against the kitchen pass-through, had stopped wiping his hands and was just listening, his expression soft with respect. Even the young woman with the bored expression had put down her phone, her face unreadable but her attention completely captured. But the most profound change was happening in the corner booth. The man in the suit sat perfectly still. The cruel smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of utter shock. The song was not just a melody to him. It was a mirror. The lyrics about hollow victories and lonely rooms at the top, about the emptiness of a life filled with things but not with meaning, were speaking directly to him. He had built a fortress of wealth and power around himself, but this simple song, sung by a waitress he had tried to break, had found a crack in the walls and was pouring into the empty spaces inside. He saw himself not as the powerful man he was, but as the lonely boy he once was, and he felt a pang of something so unfamiliar it took him a moment to recognize it. It was shame. When the last note of her song faded into the air, there was no applause. There was only a deep, profound silence. It was a different kind of silence now, not heavy with tension, but filled with awe and respect. The young woman opened her eyes and looked around the room, her gaze meeting the eyes of the other customers, who nodded at her with a new kind of understanding. She had not just sung a song. She had claimed her own story. And in doing so, she had changed the story for everyone in that room, including the man who had tried so hard to write a humiliating ending for her. He just sat there, staring at the empty space where she had stood, the $10,000 on the table in front of him suddenly looking like worthless paper. The silence that followed the last note of her song was different from the one before. It was not empty or tense, but full, as if it were holding something precious. No one moved. No one spoke. The man in the suit sat motionless, his face a mask of shock, the stack of money on the table in front of him suddenly looking like worthless paper. His friends were quiet, their smugness gone, replaced by a confused awkwardness. They looked at their boss, then at the young woman, not sure what to do or say. The spell was finally broken by the old man at the counter. He slowly put his hands together and began to clap. It wasn't a loud or enthusiastic applause, but a quiet, respectful one like rain on a tin roof. One by one, others in the diner joined in, a soft, steady rhythm of appreciation. The young woman, however, didn't seem to notice. She opened her eyes, and for a moment she looked lost, as if she had woken from a dream. She gave a small, almost shy nod to the room and then walked back to the corner booth. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She picked up her small, worn notebook from the table, her fingers brushing against the stack of $100 bills. She didn't even glance at them. She simply closed her notebook, tucked it back into her apron, picked up her order pad, and turned to the next table. "Are you ready for your check?" she asked a couple who had been watching her with wide, teary eyes. It was as if she had simply finished a chore and was moving on to the next one. The man in the suit and his friend sat there for another minute, an island of discomfort in a sea of quiet admiration. Then, without a word, the man stood up. His movements were stiff, unnatural. He straightened his expensive suit, a gesture that seemed automatic and meaningless now. He walked towards the door, his two followers scrambling to catch up. He left the $10,000 sitting on the table, a forgotten monument to a failed act of cruelty. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand on the handle. He looked back, not at the young woman, but at the empty space where she had stood and sung. His face was no longer cold or arrogant. It was just empty, a deep, hollowed-out emptiness. Then he pushed the door open and disappeared into the night. The next morning, the world woke up to the song. A young college student who had been sitting in the back of the diner had recorded the entire confrontation on her phone. She had been so angry at the man's cruelty that she wanted to do something, anything. With shaking hands, she uploaded the video to the internet with a simple caption: "Billionaire tries to humiliate a waitress." Her response was everything. She went to bed thinking maybe a few hundred people would see it. She woke up to a global firestorm. The young woman woke up to the familiar smell of her small apartment, a mix of old wood and the medicine she had to prepare for her mother. She was tired, the events of the previous night feeling like a strange, distant dream. She made her mother's breakfast, helped her with her pills, and then sat down at their small kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee. She finally pulled out her old, cracked phone. It was buzzing nonstop. Dozens of missed calls. Hundreds of messages. She didn't recognize most of the numbers. Her heart started to pound. What was going on? Then she saw it. A friend had sent her a link. She clicked on it, and the screen filled with the familiar interior of the diner. She watched herself, watched the man in the suit, heard the mocking voice of his friend. She felt a fresh wave of shame. But then she watched herself stand up and sing. She heard her own voice, raw and filled with emotion, fill the small space. She watched the comments flooding in at the bottom of the screen. They weren't just comments. They were a tidal wave of support. She is a hero. Her voice is an angel. That billionaire should be ashamed. A hashtag was trending worldwide. #DinerSongbird. She felt a strange mix of terror and awe. Her secret, the little bird she had kept hidden in her heart, was now flying all over the world for everyone to see. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. At first, she was too scared to answer. But then a call came from a number in Los Angeles. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her swipe the screen. A warm, friendly voice on the other end introduced himself as a music producer. He wasn't interested in the drama, he said. He was interested in the song. "I've been in this business for 30 years, he told her, "and I have never heard anything with that much honesty. That's not something you can fake. That's a gift." Within an hour, her life had become a whirlwind. Offers for a record deal, requests for interviews from every major news outlet, invitations to sing on television shows. A stranger, a musician from another country, had started a crowdfunding page for her and her mother. In less than a day, it had raised more than she could have earned in 10 years at the diner. The crushing weight of her mother's medical bills, the constant, gnawing worry about rent, it was all beginning to lift. For the first time in a long time, she could breathe. Meanwhile, high above the city in a penthouse that felt more like a prison than a palace, the man in the suit was living in a different kind of whirlwind. His company's stock was falling. Business partners were calling not to offer support but to distance themselves. He was becoming a villain, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. But the public backlash was nothing compared to the war raging inside him. He had spent his life building walls of wealth and power, and in just a few minutes, a simple song had torn them all down. He sat in his leather chair, staring at a screen, watching the video of the young woman over and over again. He didn't just see her. He saw himself. He saw the cruelty in his own eyes, the smugness on his face, and he felt a wave of disgust so powerful it made him feel sick. But it was the song that truly haunted him. The lyrics echoed in the vast, empty rooms of his apartment. Asterisk, concrete cracks, and the city sighs, a little light in a million eyes. He had 1,000 lights in his apartment, but none of them brought any warmth. He had millions of dollars, but they couldn't buy him a single moment of the peace he felt when she sang. He began to dig, to use his resources not to make a deal, but to understand. He found out about her mother's illness, about the double shifts she worked, about the quiet, relentless struggle of her life. He saw pictures of her as a little girl, smiling brightly, and he felt a pang of something so painful it took him a moment to recognize it. It was regret. He had tried to buy her dignity, to crush her spirit, and in doing so, he had been forced to confront his own lack of both. He was a man who had everything, and he had just been shown that he had nothing at all. The song didn't just change her life. It had shattered his, leaving him to pick up the pieces of a man he no longer recognized. Months passed and the world kept turning, but for the young woman, it had tilted on its axis and settled into a new, brighter position. The diner was a distant memory, a greasy photograph from another life. Her days were no longer filled with the clatter of plates and the smell of burnt coffee, but with the hum of recording studios and the gentle guidance of the producer who had believed in her. Her mother, resting comfortably in a clean, bright room overlooking a garden, no longer worried about medical bills. The music she had once scribbled on napkins was now being heard by millions, a voice for the quiet struggles and hidden hopes of people all over the world. The night of her first headlining show arrived. The venue was an old, beautiful theater with velvet seats and a ceiling painted with faded gold stars. Backstage, the air was thick with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. People bustled around her, adjusting microphones and checking sound levels, but she felt a strange sense of calm. She sat in a worn wooden chair, holding her small, worn notebook. It was no longer just a collection of secret dreams. It was the foundation of her new life. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one with tired feet and a heavy heart, and she felt a wave of affection for her. She hadn't left that girl behind. She had just given her a voice when she walked onto the stage. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a warm wind that almost took her breath away. The spotlight found her, a single, bright circle in the vast darkness of the theater. She could see rows and rows of faces all turned towards her, a sea of expectant eyes. She took a deep breath, the familiar scent of dust and old velvet filling her lungs, and she smiled. It wasn't the tired, practiced smile from the diner. It was a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She didn't say much. She just held her guitar, looked out at the crowd, and began to sing. The first notes filled the theater, and a hush fell over the audience. Her voice was clearer now, stronger from practice, but it still held that same raw, honest quality that had captivated the world. She sang the songs from her notebook, the songs about struggle and hope, about cracked concrete and city lights. She sang about her mother, about the kindness of strangers, about finding strength in the broken places. As she sang, she felt a connection with every person in the room, a shared understanding that went beyond words. She wasn't just a performer. She was a storyteller, and her story was their story. High up in the last row of the balcony, tucked into the shadows, a man sat alone. He was dressed in a simple, dark sweater, a stark contrast to the expensive suits he used to wear. He had bought the ticket online, just like everyone else, and had slipped into the theater unnoticed. He had not come to be seen. He had come to listen. As her voice washed over him, he felt a profound sense of peace. He saw the confidence in her posture, the joy in her eyes as she sang, and he felt a pang of something that felt like a mixture of regret and relief. He had tried to extinguish this light, and instead he had made it shine brighter. He watched the faces in the crowd, the tears, the smiles, the rapt attention, and he understood that he had been a small, cruel part of a much bigger, more beautiful story. He stayed until the very end, until the last encore had faded and the lights came up. Then, like a ghost, he slipped out of the theater and into the quiet night. Just another face in the crowd. That the next morning, the young woman received a phone call that would once again change everything. It was the administrator from the hospital where her mother was staying. The voice on the other end was filled with a kind, excited energy. "I have some wonderful news," the administrator said. "A very substantial, anonymous donation has been made to the hospital. All of your mother's past, present, and future medical expenses have been completely covered. But that's not all. The donor has also funded the creation of a new wing, a special place for artists and musicians who don't have health insurance so they can get the care they need. It's going to be named after your mother." The young woman was speechless. She sank onto her bed, the phone pressed to her ear, her mind racing. She didn't have to guess who was responsible. The act was too grand, too specific, and too private to be anyone else. It was not an apology. It was an atonement. He wasn't just trying to fix what he had broken. He was trying to build something good from the ruins of his own cruelty. He had learned a lesson, a deep and painful one, and this was his way of proving it. She felt a sense of closure, a quiet understanding that settled in her heart. The anger and shame she had felt that night in the diner were finally gone, replaced by a sense of gratitude for the strange, difficult journey that had led her here. She didn't call him. She didn't try to find him. A public confrontation would cheapen his act of private redemption. Instead, she did something simpler, something that felt more true to the person she had become. She took a piece of plain, white paper from a notepad on her desk. She thought for a long time about what to write. "Thank you" felt too small. "I forgive you" felt too presumptuous. She wanted to acknowledge his role in her story, not just as the villain, but as the catalyst. She wanted to honor the fact that he had, in the end, listened. Finally, she picked up a pen and wrote 3 simple words. She folded the note, put it in an envelope, and addressed it to his office. She didn't put a return address on it. She didn't need a reply. The act of sending it was enough. Days later, the envelope arrived at the sleek glass tower where the man's company was headquartered. It was placed on his desk among a stack of important-looking documents. He opened it, his heart beating a little faster. He read the 3 words on the small piece of paper. "Thank you for listening." He read them again, and then a third time. He didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, holding the small note in his large hand. He looked out his window at the sprawling city below, a city he had once tried to conquer but now only wanted to be a small, quiet part of. The note was not an absolution. It was not an invitation. It was a simple, powerful acknowledgement of a shared moment of humanity. It was the closing of a circle. And for the first time in a very long time, looking out at the millions of lights below, he felt a quiet, gentle sense of peace. The song had changed everything, indeed.